Hello, dear friends. Settle in with a cup of tea or coffee and dive into a cozy tale of seafaring adventures from the past. This is a story of bold 15th-century explorers who braved vast oceans in search of new lands, filled with mystery and wonder. It will warm your heart and carry you to a world of sails and stars. Enjoyed it? Like, subscribe, and comment when you're watching, morning or evening. It really helps me keep going. In the evening sky above Lisbon in 1492, a thick sea fog mingled with the salty scent of the ocean drifting from the mouth of the Tagus River. Through the narrow, cobbled streets of Alfama, where taverns hummed with life and the air carried the aroma of roasted chestnuts, a man strode purposefully, his weathered leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His name was Matthias, a cartographer's apprentice, barely 20, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that burned with a restless curiosity. His cloak, patched and frayed at the hem, flapped against his legs as he hurried toward the docks, clutching a rolled parchment under his arm. The parchment was no ordinary map. It was a whisper of something grand, something that could shift the tides of the world. The streets were alive that evening, their pulse quickened by rumors. Sailors, merchants, and fishwives swapped tales in the glow of flickering oil lamps. A Genoese mariner named Cristoforo, they said, had been seen at the court of King João II, speaking of lands beyond the horizon, of a westward route to the riches of Cathay and the Spice Islands. Most scoffed, calling it madness. The ocean was vast, they said, a graveyard of ships swallowed by monsters or storms. Yet Matthias, who had spent years tracing the jagged coastlines of Africa in his master's workshop, felt a spark of something, hope, perhaps, or the reckless pull of the unknown. He paused at the edge of the docks, where the air grew heavy with the tang of tar and seaweed. The masts of caravels swayed gently, their rigging creaking like a chorus of old bones. The water lapped against the hulls, reflecting the last embers of a sunset that painted the sky in hues of amber and bruised purple. Matthias unrolled the parchment, his hands trembling not from the chill but from the weight of what it held, a crude sketch of the world as it was known, with vast, empty spaces where the ocean stretched into mystery. His master, old Diogo, had dismissed Cristoforo's claims, saying no man could sail west and live. But Matthias, staring at the blank edges of the map, wondered if those voids held secrets waiting to be drawn. The story begins here, with a single moment, a young man, a map, and a rumor that would soon ripple across seas and centuries. This was no grand council or royal decree, but a quiet spark in the heart of a nobody, standing on a dock as the world teetered on the edge of change. To understand how it all began, we must linger here, in the salt-soaked air of Lisbon, where dreams of discovery were as tangible as the ropes tethering ships to shore. Matthias's day had started like any other, in the dim, musty workshop of Diogo the cartographer, tucked behind a butcher's stall in the Barro Alto. The room smelled of vellum, ink, and the faint mildew of old books. Shelves sagged under the weight of scrolls, their edges curling like dried leaves. Diogo, a man with a beard like sea foam and hands gnarled from decades of quill work, was hunched over a table, muttering about the inaccuracies of Ptolemy's Geographia. Matthias, as always, was tasked with grinding pigments for ink, ochre for land, azure for seas, while his mind wandered to the stories he'd overheard in the market. Boy! Diogo had barked that morning, not looking up from his work. Stop daydreaming. The world doesn't redraw itself. Matthias had nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere, snagged on a conversation he'd caught the night before at the Taberna do Peaks. Two sailors, their faces ruddy from wine, had spoken of Cristoforo Colombo, a man with wild eyes and a tongue that spun tales of gold and silk waiting across the Western Ocean. They'd laughed, calling him a fool, but Matthias had lingered by their table, soaking in every word. What if it was true? What if the world was bigger than the maps in Diogo's shop? Now, standing at the docks, Matthias felt the weight of that question. The parchment in his hands was a copy of Diogo's latest chart, one he'd been forbidden to touch. He'd snuck it out anyway, driven by a need he couldn't name. The map showed the known world: Europe, Africa's western coast, and the scattered islands of the Azores and Madeira. Beyond that, nothing, just a vast expanse labelled Mare Ignotum, the unknown sea. Matthias traced his finger over the empty space, imagining lands no one had seen, islands of spice and cities of jade. His breath caught at the thought. Was this what Cristoforo saw in his mind's eye? A shout broke his reverie. "Oi, lad! Mind the ropes!" A docker, hauling a crate of salted cod, glared at Matthias as he stumbled out of the way. The docks were a chaos of movement, sailors coiling ropes, merchants haggling over barrels of wine, and urchins darting underfoot, hoping to snatch a dropped coin. The air buzzed with languages: Portuguese, Castilian, Genoese, even the guttural tones of Basque fishermen. Matthias tucked the parchment under his cloak and moved toward a quieter corner, where a small caravel named Santa Clara was being loaded with provisions. The Santa Clara was no grand vessel. Its hull was scarred from years of coastal runs, its sails patched like Matthias's cloak. Yet it was bound for the Canaries, a staging point for voyages into the unknown. Rumour had it Cristoforo's own ships were being readied there, under the patronage of the Castilian monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. Matthias had overheard Diogo muttering about it, dismissing the Genoese as a dreamer who'd drown himself and his crew. But Matthias couldn't shake the image of those ships slicing through the dark waves, chasing a horizon no one else dared to pursue. He leaned against a bollard, watching as crates of hardtack and casks of water were hoisted aboard the Santa Clara. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from a nearby stall, mingling with the sharper notes of pitch and brine. His stomach growled. He'd had only a heel of rye bread and a sliver of cheese since dawn, but he ignored it, too caught up in the scene. A woman with a basket of oranges passed by, her skirts swaying as she called out her wares. Sweet as the sun, fresh from the groves. Matthias fished a copper coin from his pocket, trading it for a single fruit. He peeled it slowly, the zest stinging his cracked hands, and savoured the burst of tart juice on his tongue. For a moment the world felt vivid, alive with possibility. As he ate, a figure caught his eye, a man standing near the Santa Clara's gangplank, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. He was tall, with a shock of reddish hair and a weathered face that spoke of years at sea. His clothes were modest but well kept, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the ocean's moods. Matthias recognized him from the Tabernadou peaks, João Afonso, a pilot who'd sailed with Bartholomew Dias around the Cape of Good Hope. Afonso was no noble, but his name carried weight in Lisbon's maritime circles. Matthias hesitated, then approached, his heart thudding. "Señor Afonso," he ventured, clutching the parchment tighter. The man turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "Matthias, apprentice to Diogo the cartographer." He swallowed, feeling small under Afonso's gaze. I heard you speak of the Genoese, Cristoforo Colombo. Is it true he's sailing west?" Afonso's expression softened, but only slightly. "You're young to be chasing such tales, lad. Colombo's a madman, or so they say. Thinks he can reach Cathay by sailing into the sunset." King João turned him away, but the Castilians seemed to have taken the bait. Matthias's pulse quickened. "And you, señor? Do you believe him?" Afonso studied him, as if weighing whether to answer. At last he said, "I've seen the ocean's tricks, storms that swallow ships, currents that lead nowhere. But I've also seen men return from places no map shows. If Colombo's right, the world's bigger than any of us know. If he's wrong," he shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips, "the sea keeps its own counsel." Matthias nodded, his mind racing. Afonso's words were no endorsement, but they weren't dismissal either. They were a door cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. He glanced at the Santa Clara, its crew shouting orders as they secured the last of the cargo. A thought struck him, bold and reckless. What if he could join them? Not on Columbo's voyage, perhaps, but on some ship bound for the edge of the known world. He was no sailor, but he could read the stars, plot a course, draw a chart. Surely that was worth something. Before he could speak, Afonso clapped him on the shoulder. "Keep your feet on land, boy. The sea's no place for dreamers without coin or skill." With that, he turned and strode toward the ship, leaving Matthias alone with his map and his thoughts. The sun had vanished now, leaving the docks bathed in the soft glow of lanterns. Matthias stood rooted, the orange peel still in his hand, its scent lingering like a promise. He looked at the parchment, its blank spaces taunting him. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, were answers, lands uncharted, riches untold, or perhaps nothing but endless waves. The rumor of Columbo's voyage was spreading, a spark that could ignite a fire. Matthias felt it in his bones. This was the beginning of something vast, something that would redraw the world. He rolled up the map and tucked it under his arm, his decision made. He would find a way to follow that spark, to see where it led. As he turned back toward the city, the first stars pierced the sky, and the creak of the Santa Clara's timbers seemed to whisper, "Go." The night deepened, and Lisbon's docks grew quiet, save for the lapping of waves and the distant laughter from a tavern. Matthias's footsteps echoed on the cobbles as he made his way back to the workshop, his mind alight with possibilities. He didn't know it yet, but his small act of defiance, stealing that map, seeking out Afonso, had set him on a path that would carry him far from the familiar streets of Alfama. The world was stirring, and he was caught in its current. For now, though, he was just a boy with a map, standing at the edge of history. The rumor of a westward voyage was spreading, and with it, the promise of new lands, new lives, and new dangers. What would Matthias find if he followed that call? Would he sail with the dreamers, or remain tethered to the shore, tracing the edges of a world he'd never see? The answer lay beyond the horizon, waiting. The air in Lisbon had grown heavier in the weeks following Matthias's encounter at the docks, as if the city itself were holding its breath. It was late summer, 1492, and the rumor of Cristoforo Colombo's westward voyage had spread like wildfire through the taverns, markets, and shipyards. The name of the Genoese mariner was on every tongue, whispered with equal parts scorn and wonder. Some called him a visionary, others a fool bound for a watery grave. But to Matthias, the cartographer's apprentice, the rumor was a siren's call, pulling him toward a future he could scarcely imagine. He stood now at the edge of the Berro Alto, gazing down at the Tagus River, where ships bobbed like restless horses eager to break free. The morning sun glinted off the water, casting shards of light that danced like coins scattered on a table. The scent of baked bread and smoked fish drifted from the market stalls below, mingling with the ever-present tang of salt and tar. Matthias's fingers tightened around the strap of his satchel, where the stolen map still lay hidden. Since that night on the docks, he'd carried it everywhere, a secret talisman that tethered him to the possibility of something greater. The city was changing. Word of Colombo's preparations in the Canaries had reached Lisbon, carried by traders and sailors who spoke of 3 ships, Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, loaded with provisions and ambition. The news had stirred the port like a stone tossed into a still pond. Merchants speculated on new trade routes, sailors debated the risks, and families whispered of opportunities in lands yet unseen. Matthias felt it too, a restless energy that pulsed through the streets, urging people to move, to chase the unknown. He was no different. The map in his satchel was a weight, a challenge, a question. Would he stay in the workshop, grinding pigments for Diogo's charts, or would he follow the tide? Mateus's days in the workshop had grown unbearable. Diogo, his master, was as gruff as ever, his temper sharpened by the city's feverish talk of exploration. "Fools, all of them," he'd mutter, hunched over a map of the African coast. "Chasing dreams across an ocean that'll swallow them whole." Mateus kept silent, sweeping the floor or mixing inks, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd overheard snippets of news. Colombo had sailed from Palos de la Frontera in early August, his ships cutting through the waves toward the Canaries. From there, they'd plunge into the Mare Ignotum, the unknown sea. The thought made Mateus's heart race. What would they find? Islands of spice? Cities of gold? Or nothing but endless water? One morning, as he scrubbed the workshop's tables, Mateus overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two merchants, their voices low and urgent, stood just outside the open door. "They're saying the Castilians are pouring coin into these ventures," one said, his voice thick with envy. "If Colombo's right, they'll claim the trade routes to Cathay. Lisbon will be left in the dust." The other snorted. "And if he's wrong, they'll lose their ships and their gold. But mark me, others will follow. The Canaries are already buzzing. Sailors, map-makers, even farmers looking for new land." Mateus froze, the rag in his hand dripping onto the floor. Farmers, map-makers, the words lodged in his chest like a hook. He'd always thought exploration was for sailors and nobles, men with coin or courage. But if ordinary folk were joining the tide, could he? He was no pilot like João Afonso, but he could read a quadrant, plot a course, draw a chart. Surely that was worth something. The idea took root, growing wilder with each passing hour. That evening he made his way to the Tabernadou Peaks, where the air was thick with the scent of grilled sardines and spilled wine. The tavern was a hub for sailors and dreamers, its walls stained with smoke and stories. Mateus slipped inside, his cloak pulled tight against the evening chill, and found a corner near the hearth. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the faces of men hunched over their cups. He ordered a bowl of fish stew, its broth rich with garlic and bay leaves, and listened as the talk swirled around him. "They say Colombo's crew is a ragtag lot," a grizzled sailor muttered, his hands wrapped around a tankard. "Convicts, debtors, boys barely weaned from their mothers. He'll need more than luck to keep them alive." A younger man, his face still smooth, laughed nervously. "But if he finds Cathay, think of it, silk, spices, gold enough to drown in." The room buzzed with arguments, some dismissing Colombo, others dreaming of the wealth his voyage might unlock. Mateus sipped his stew, the warmth spreading through him, and felt the pull of their words. He wasn't alone in his restlessness. The whole city was stirring, ready to chase the horizon. The next day, Mateus made a decision. He would leave Lisbon, not on Colombo's ships, those were already gone, but on another, bound for the Canaries or perhaps further. The Canaries were the gateway, the last known outpost before the great unknown. If he could reach them, he might find a ship, a captain, a chance. The thought was terrifying, exhilarating. He had no coin to speak of, no family to bid farewell, only the skills in his hands and the map in his satchel. But that would have to be enough. He waited until dusk, when Diogo was snoring in his chair, to slip into the workshop and gather what he needed: a spare quill, a vial of ink, a small astrolabe he'd learned to use in secret. He left a note, short, apologetic, promising to repay Diogo some day, and crept out into the night. The streets were quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the creak of a cartwheel. The air smelled of rain and river mud, and Mateus's boots sank slightly into the damp cobbles as he made his way to the docks. There he found the Santa Clara, the caravel he'd seen weeks ago. It was set to sail at dawn, bound for the Canaries with a cargo of wine and wool. Matthias approached the quartermaster, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, and offered his services. "I'm a map-maker's apprentice," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I can read the stars, plot a course, draw what we find." The quartermaster squinted at him, chewing on a piece of straw. "No coin for passengers, boy. You work, you eat. You slack, you swim." Matthias nodded, his heart pounding. It was done. By morning he was aboard, squeezed into a corner of the deck with his satchel clutched to his chest. The Santa Clara cast off as the sun rose, painting the Tagus in shades of gold and rose. Matthias stood at the rail, watching Lisbon shrink into the distance. The city that had been his world, its smoky taverns, its crowded markets, its maps and dreams, was now just a smudge on the horizon. He felt a pang of loss, sharp as a knife, but it was drowned by the thrill of what lay ahead. The creak of the ship's timbers, the snap of its sails, the salt spray on his face. It was all new, all alive. The voyage to the Canaries took 10 days, each one a lesson in endurance. Matthias was no sailor, and the crew made sure he knew it. They sent him scrambling up the rigging to untangle ropes, hauling buckets of bilge water from the hold, scrubbing decks until his hands bled. At night, he collapsed onto a pile of sacks in the hold, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and sour wine. Meals were meagre, hardtack that crumbled like chalk, dried fish that tasted of salt and regret, but Matthias ate without complaint, savoring the moments when he could steal away to the deck and watch the stars. The crew was a motley bunch: grizzled Portuguese sailors, a Castilian cook who sang off-key, a Genoese boy no older than Matthias who claimed he'd seen mermaids. They swapped stories as they worked, tales of storms and shipwrecks, of islands where the trees dripped with honey. Matthias listened, his quill scratching notes on scraps of vellum. He sketched the horizon each evening, noting the way the clouds piled up like mountains or scattered like flocks of birds. The ocean was vast, unending, its surface a mirror for the sky's moods, calm one day, roiling the next. He began to understand why men spoke of it with both fear and reverence. When they reached the Canaries, the islands rose from the sea like green jewels, their peaks wreathed in mist. The port of Las Palmas was a hive of activity, ships crowding the harbor, their flags snapping in the trade winds. Matthias disembarked, his legs unsteady on solid ground, and felt the world expand around him. The air was warm, scented with pine and citrus, and the streets were alive with voices: Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, languages he couldn't name. Sailors bartered for fresh water and fruit. Merchants haggled over casks of Momsey wine. And everywhere the talk was of Colombo, his ships already gone, vanished into the west. Matthias found work with a local map-maker, a grizzled Moor named Ibrahim who'd settled in the islands after fleeing Granada. Ibrahim's shop was a clutter of charts and instruments, its walls hung with maps that showed the world in dizzying detail. He took Matthias on, not out of kindness, but because he needed hands to copy charts for the ships flooding the port. Matthias worked late into the night, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes burning from the candlelight. But he was learning the currents that swept past the islands, the winds that could carry a ship to glory or ruin. One evening, as he sat copying a chart of the African coast, Ibrahim leaned over his shoulder. "You're not here for my maps, are you, boy?" he said, his voice low and knowing. Matthias hesitated, then shook his head. "I want to see what's out there," he admitted. "What Colombo's gone to find." Ibrahim's eyes gleamed. "Then you're a fool, like him. But fools change the world, sometimes." He handed Matthias a small, worn book, a sailor's log from a voyage years before, filled with notes on winds and stars. "Study this," he said, "and pray you're lucky." Matthias lay awake that night, the book open on his chest, the sounds of Los Palmas drifting through the window, laughter, the clink of cups, the distant crash of waves. The Canaries were a crossroads, a place where men from every corner of the known world converged, chasing the same dream that had brought him here. The rumor of Colombo's voyage had grown into something larger, a tide pulling people from their homes, their lives, their certainties. Matthias felt it too, a current stronger than any he'd known. He was no longer just an apprentice, no longer bound to Lisbon's narrow streets. He was part of something vast, something that would redraw the maps he'd spent his life studying. But what lay ahead? Would Colombo return with tales of Cathay, or would his ships vanish into the sea's embrace? And what of Matthias, a boy with a stolen map and a heart full of questions? The Canaries were only the beginning, a stepping stone to the unknown. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the world was waiting to be drawn. The sun hung low over Las Palmas, casting a golden haze across the harbor where ships swayed like weary travelers. Matthias had been in the Canaries for 3 weeks, and the rhythm of the islands had seeped into his bones. The air was thick with the scent of ripe figs and wood smoke, undercut by the ever-present brine of the sea. Each morning he woke to the clatter of carts and the shouts of vendors hawking bread and fish in the market square. By night he fell asleep to the hum of cicadas and the distant crash of waves against the volcanic cliffs. Life here was both vibrant and precarious, a fragile existence carved out on the edge of the known world. For Matthias, it was a lesson in survival, a daily dance of labor, hunger, and fleeting moments of wonder. His days were spent in Ibrahim's cramped shop, copying charts under the Moor's watchful eye. The work was grueling, hours bent over vellum, his fingers cramped from clutching a quill, his eyes stinging from the smoke of tallow candles. But it kept him fed, if barely. Ibrahim paid him in coin and scraps, a handful of almonds, a wedge of hard cheese, a crust of barley bread still warm from the oven. Matthias savored each bite, learning to stretch his meals through the day. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened when he passed stalls piled with oranges or roasting skewers of goat. Yet there was a strange comfort in it, a reminder that he was alive, striving, part of something larger than himself. The Canaries were a crossroads, a melting pot of sailors, traders, and wanderers drawn by the promise of new horizons. Matthias saw it in the faces around him, men and women from Lisbon, Seville, Genoa, even distant Morocco, their eyes alight with dreams or shadowed by desperation. They were all chasing something: wealth, freedom, a new start. And survival here demanded more than skill or coin. It required grit, cunning, and a willingness to adapt to the island's unforgiving rhythms. Matthias's mornings began before dawn, when the air was still cool and the streets quiet save for the scuttle of rats. He'd rise from his pallet in the back of Ibrahim's shop, a thin mat of straw that smelled faintly of mildew. His first task was to fetch water from the well in the plaza, a heavy bucket sloshing against his legs as he navigated the uneven cobbles. The water was brackish, with a mineral tang that clung to his tongue, but it was better than the stale casks on the ships. He'd splash his face, the cold jolt waking him fully, then set to work grinding pigments or cleaning the shop's cluttered tables. Breakfast, when he could afford it, was a simple affair: a handful of dried figs or a bowl of porridge made from barley and goat's milk, its surface flecked with cinnamon Ibrahim sometimes shared. The taste was earthy, comforting, a small anchor in the chaos of his days. He ate slowly, perched on a stool outside the shop, watching the harbor come alive. Fishermen hauled in nets glinting with sardines, their scales catching the light like tiny mirrors. Women with baskets balanced on their heads called out their wares: lemons, pomegranates, flatbreads dusted with sesame. The air carried their voices, sharp and melodic, blending with the creak of ship timbers and the cries of gulls. Work in the shop was relentless. Ibrahim was a taskmaster, his sharp tongue as precise as his quills. "Straighter lines, boy," he'd snap, peering over Matthias's shoulder. "The sea doesn't forgive sloppiness." Matthias learned to steady his hand, to trace coastlines with care, to mark shoals and currents that could spell life or death for a ship. He copied charts of the Canaries, the Azores, the African coast, each line a thread in the tapestry of a world he longed to see. At night, when Ibrahim retired, Matthias studied the sailor's log the old man had given him, memorizing descriptions of trade winds and star patterns. The log smelled of salt and age, its pages brittle under his fingers, but it was a lifeline, a guide to the unknown. Survival wasn't just about work or food. It was about navigating the human currents of Las Palmas. The port was a hive of schemers and dreamers, and Matthias learned quickly to keep his wits sharp. Once, a wiry Genoese sailor tried to swindle him out of his day's wages, offering a rare astrolabe that turned out to be a rusted lump of brass. Matthias caught the trick just in time, his cheeks burning with embarrassment but his coin still in his pocket. Another time, a drunkard in a tavern corner offered him a place on a ship bound for Madeira, only to demand a bribe Matthias couldn't pay. The islands were full of such traps, and Matthias learned to trust his instincts, to read the glint in a man's eye or the weight of his words. Yet there were moments of kindness, too, small sparks that kept him going. One evening, as he sat sketching the harbour's outline, a baker's wife named Clara slipped him a warm loaf studded with olives, her smile soft as the bread's crust. "You're too thin, lad," she said, waving off his stammered thanks. Another time, a grizzled sailor named Tomás, who'd sailed with Diaz, shared a flask of palm wine and a story of a storm that nearly sank his ship off Cape Verde. "The sea tests you," Tomás said, his voice rough as gravel. "But it gives back, too, if you learn its ways." Matthias listened, his quill scratching notes, the wine's sweet burn lingering on his tongue. Life on the islands wasn't just about survival. It was about adaptation, about finding a place in a world that was always shifting. Matthias began to notice the small rituals that anchored the people of Las Palmas. At midday, when the sun blazed, the market would quiet, and families would gather in the shade of palm trees, sharing plates of stewed goat or fish roasted over coals. The food was simple but vivid. Octopus simmered in garlic and paprika, its flesh tender and smoky, flatbreads dipped in a sauce of crushed almonds and herbs, sharp and fragrant. Matthias joined these meals when he could, sitting cross-legged with sailors or dockworkers, their laughter easing the ache in his shoulders. The evenings were for stories. In the taverns, men spun tales of distant lands, some true, some embroidered with fantasy. Matthias heard of islands where pearls grew like grapes, of seas where fish leapt into nets unbidden. He'd sit by the fire, its warmth a balm against the night's chill, and sketch what he heard: jagged coastlines, imagined harbours, currents that might exist only in a sailor's mind. The smoke from the hearth curled upward, carrying the scent of burning pine, and Matthias felt a kinship with these men, bound by their shared hunger for what lay beyond. Sleep was a luxury, often stolen in snatches between tasks. Matthias's palate was no softer than the deck of the Santa Clara, but he grew used to its lumps, to the way the straw poked through the cloth. His dreams were vivid, coloured by the day's work and the island's sounds, waves crashing, sails snapping, voices calling in a dozen tongues. In one dream, he stood on a shore of white sand, the sea before him endless and blue, a map unrolling in his hands to reveal lands no one had named. He woke with his heart pounding, the taste of salt on his lips. One afternoon, as Matthias swept the shop's floor, Ibrahim called him over. The old man was hunched over a new chart, his fingers tracing a line that stretched west from the Canaries into the void of the Mare Ignotum. "They're saying Colombo's ships haven't returned," Ibrahim said, his voice low. "No word, no sign. Some think he's lost. Others, they're starting to believe he might have found something." Matthias's breath caught. The rumour that had brought him here was growing, shifting, taking on new weight. If Colombo had found land, what did it mean? New trade routes? New worlds? Or was it all a mirage, a tale to lure more men into the sea's jaws? Ibrahim handed him a fresh sheet of vellum. "Draw it," he said. "Draw what you think he's found." Matthias hesitated, then took the quill. His hand moved slowly, sketching an island, then another, their shapes born from the stories he'd heard, lush with trees, fringed with reefs, kissed by trade winds. It was a guess, a dream, but it felt real under his fingers. Ibrahim watched, his eyes unreadable. "Keep that," he said when Matthias finished. "It might be worth something someday." That night, Matthias sat on the harbor's edge, the vellum in his hands. The air was cool, scented with seaweed and the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine. The stars above were sharp, a map of their own, guiding ships through the dark. Matthias traced the constellations he'd learned, Ursa Major, Orion, the bright beacon of Venus, and felt the pull of the sea stronger than ever. Colombo's voyage, whether triumph or tragedy, had set something in motion. Men were already talking of new expeditions, of ships to follow in the Genoese wake. The Canaries were no longer just a way station, they were a launch pad, a place where dreams took sail. Matthias folded the vellum and tucked it into his satchel, next to the stolen map from Lisbon. He was surviving, yes, but he wanted more. He wanted to be part of the story, not just its scribe. The islands had taught him to endure, to live on bread and hope, but they'd also shown him the world's vastness. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the future was being written. Would he stay here, scratching out charts for others to follow, or would he take the next step, chase the rumor to its source? The waves whispered against the shore, and Matthias felt the answer forming, quiet but sure. The harbor of Las Palmas shimmered under a late September sun, its waters a mosaic of turquoise and gold. Matthias had been in the Canaries for nearly 2 months now, and the islands had become a second skin, their rhythms as familiar as the beat of his own heart. The air was alive with the sense of roasted coffee and sun-warmed stone, threaded with the sharp tang of fish drying on racks along the shore. Each day brought new faces to the port, sailors from Lisbon, merchants from Seville, Berber traders from the African coast, each carrying their own customs, languages, and dreams. The Canaries were a crucible, a place where cultures collided and blended, sparking tensions and wonders in equal measure. For Matthias, it was a chance to see the world not just through maps, but through the lives of those who shaped it. His days in Ibrahim's shop were long, but the evenings were his own, and he spent them wandering the streets of Las Palmas, soaking in the kaleidoscope of human experience. The town was a tapestry of voices, the rapid-fire Spanish of Castilian sailors, the lilting Arabic of Moorish exiles, the guttural Portuguese of fishermen like those he'd known in Lisbon. Each group brought its own flavor to the islands, from the songs sung in smoky taverns to the spices that perfumed the air. Matthias, with his ink-stained hands and curious eyes, was a sponge, absorbing it all, his satchel heavy with sketches and notes that captured not just coastlines but the pulse of this fleeting, vibrant world. One evening, Matthias found himself in the Plaza de la Fuente, a bustling square where traders and locals gathered as the day cooled. The cobblestones were worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, and the air carried the scent of grilled octopus and anise bread from a nearby stall. A group of Genoese sailors, their faces bronzed by the sun, sat around a table, laughing over cups of Momsey wine. Nearby, a Berber woman in a blue headscarf sold baskets of dates, her hands moving with a grace that belied the weight of her load. Matthias paused, drawn to a small crowd gathered around a man playing a oud, its strings humming a mournful tune that seemed to weave the square's chaos into harmony. He sat on a low wall, pulling a piece of vellum from his satchel to sketch the scene. His quill scratched out the curve of the oud player's back, the sway of the woman's scarf, the glint of wine in the sailors' cups. As he worked, a girl no older than 15 approached, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She wore a simple dress of undyed linen, patched at the knees, and carried a tray of flatbreads wrapped in palm leaves. "You draw the world, yes?" she asked, her Spanish accented with the soft vowels of the Guanche, the island's native people. Matthias nodded, surprised. "I try. The world's big, and I've only seen a piece of it." She smiled, setting her tray beside him. "Take one. No coin, just tell me what you see." He hesitated, then chose a bread, its surface dusted with sesame and still warm from the fire. The first bite was crisp, then soft, with a faint sweetness that lingered on his tongue. "I see people," he said, gesturing at the square. "From everywhere. They bring their stories, their food, their songs. Like this bread. It's not just bread, is it?" She laughed, a sound like bells. "It's my mother's. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from the land before the Spanish came. We mix goat's milk and wild honey. You taste the island in it." Her name, she said, was Tenosu, after a Guanche warrior who'd fought the Castilians. She spoke of her people's ways, how they once lived in caves carved from volcanic rock, how they honored the stars with dances under the open sky. Matthias listened, his quill forgotten, as she described a world older than the ships crowding the harbor, a world of stone and wind and memory. Their conversation was cut short by a shout from a nearby stall. A Castilian merchant, his face red with wine, was arguing with a Moorish trader over a bolt of cloth. "You cheat me," the Castilian bellowed, his hand on the hilt of a dagger. The Moor, calm but firm, replied in accented Spanish, "The price is fair, senor. You know silk from Fez when you see it." The crowd thickened, voices rising, and Matthias felt Tenosu tense beside him. These clashes were common in Las Palmas, where mistrust simmered beneath the surface of trade. The islands were a meeting ground, but not always a peaceful one. Tenosu slipped away, her tray balanced expertly, and Matthias returned to his sketch, adding the merchant's scowl, the trader's steady gaze. The oud player struck a new chord, and the tension eased, the crowd dispersing into laughter and chatter. Matthias realized then that the Canaries were not just a port but a stage, where cultures met, clashed, and sometimes wove together into something new. In Ibrahim's shop, Matthias saw more of this blending. The old Moor was a bridge between worlds, his charts drawing on knowledge from Arab navigators, Portuguese explorers, and even the Guanche, who'd sailed the island's waters long before Columbus's name was known. One afternoon, Ibrahim showed Matthias a map drawn on goatskin, its edges decorated with star patterns he said came from Bedouin sailors. "The stars don't change," Ibrahim said, his voice soft as he traced a constellation. "But the men who read them do. We borrow from each other, Greeks, Arabs, Christians, and the world grows larger." Matthias began to notice these borrowings everywhere. In the market, he tasted a stew of chickpeas and lamb, spiced with cumin and saffron, that a Moroccan cook swore was born in the souks of Marrakesh. Yet the bread served with it was Guanche, flat and earthy, baked on hot stones. In a tavern, he heard a Portuguese fado singer weave her mournful notes with a rhythm that echoed the Guanche drumbeats he'd heard at a festival. Even the clothes told stories. Sailors in Castilian doublets mixed with Berbers in flowing robes, while Guanche women wore shawls dyed with indigo from the African coast. One night, Matthias joined a gathering at the edge of town, where a Guanche elder led a ceremony to honor the harvest. The air was cool, scented with pine and sea salt, and a bonfire cast shadows on the gathered crowd. Natives, sailors, traders, all drawn by the promise of food and song. The elder, his face lined like the island's cliffs, poured a libation of goat's milk onto the earth, chanting in a language Matthias couldn't understand. Then came the feast: roasted kid, its skin crisp and fragrant with rosemary, bowls of gofio, a Guanche flour mixed with honey and water, its texture gritty but rich, and a sweet wine that warmed Matthias's throat. He ate with his hands, sitting on the ground beside Tanosu, who taught him a Guanche word for the stars, Taburient, meaning those that guide. The songs that followed were a tapestry of voices, Guanche chants, Spanish ballads, a Moorish love song that made the sailors sigh. Matthias sketched as he listened, capturing the flicker of firelight on faces, the curve of a dancer's arm, the way the crowd seemed to breathe as one. He realized that this was what made the Canaries alive, not just the ships or the trade, but the way people carried their homes in their songs, their food, their stories, and shared them under a sky that belonged to no one. Yet not all encounters were harmonious. Matthias saw the friction too, the sidelong glances at Moorish traders, the muttered slurs against Guanche laborers, the way Castilian priests frowned at the islanders' rituals. One morning, he witnessed a scuffle in the market when a Spanish sailor accused a Guanche boy of stealing a knife. The boy, no older than 12, stood defiant, his fists clenched, until an elder intervened, calming the crowd with quiet words. Matthias felt the weight of it, the way old wounds festered beneath the surface. The islands were a new world for some, but for others they were a home reshaped by strangers. In the shop, Ibrahim spoke of this tension. "We're all exiles here," he said one evening, his hands stained with ink. "I left Granada when the Christians came. The Guanche lost their lands to the Castilians. Even you, boy, you left Lisbon for a dream. We meet, we trade, we fight, but we also learn. That's how the world turns." Matthias nodded, thinking of Tanosu's bread, the oud player's tune, the star patterns on Ibrahim's maps. The Canaries were a place of loss and discovery, where cultures didn't just meet. They reshaped each other, leaving traces in every bite, every note, every line on a chart. As October approached, the talk of Colombo's voyage grew louder. Rumors swirled. His ships had been sighted or lost, or had found a new land brimming with gold. Matthias listened, his quill scratching faster, his sketches growing bolder. He drew imagined islands, their shores fringed with palms, their rivers winding through jungles. He showed one to Tanosu, who laughed and said, "Maybe you'll name a star for me there." Her words lingered, a spark of connection in a world of constant motion. One night, as Matthias sat by the harbor, the air heavy with the scent of rain, he unfolded his vellum sketch from the plaza. The oud player, the sailors, Tanosu's smile, they were all there, a moment captured in ink. The Canaries had taught him that the world was not just land and sea, but people, their stories, their struggles, their gifts. He felt the pull of the horizon stronger than ever, but now it was not just a dream of discovery. It was a call to carry these encounters with him, to draw not just maps but the lives that filled them. What would he find if he followed that call? Would the new lands, if they existed, be a place of harmony or strife? And what of the people he'd met here? Tanosu, Ibrahim, the sailors whose songs still echoed in his ears. The answers lay west, where the sea met the sky, and Matthias knew he could not stay still much longer. The air in Las Palmas had grown restless as October 1492 settled over the Canaries, a faint chill creeping into the evenings. The harbour still bustled, its waters glinting under a sun that seemed less generous now, its light thinner, more brittle. Matthias, now a fixture in Ibrahim's shop, felt the shift in the town's pulse. The rumours of Colombo's voyage had not quieted. If anything, they'd grown sharper, edged with uncertainty. No word had come from the Genoese ships, and the silence fed a creeping unease. Whispers of failure, of ships lost to storms or sea monsters, mingled with tales of treachery and greed. The Canaries, for all their vibrancy, were not immune to the darker currents that ran beneath their surface: hunger, betrayal, and the ever-present shadow of the unknown. For Matthias, these weeks would reveal the cost of chasing dreams, the fragility of hope in a world where survival often came at a price. The days were still long in Ibrahim's shop, the air thick with the scent of ink and dust, but Matthias had grown accustomed to the grind. His hands were steadier now, his charts more precise, earning grudging nods from the old Moor. Yet the work, once a refuge, felt heavier now, weighed down by the stories he heard in the streets. The Canaries were a crossroads, yes, but they were also a crucible where desperation forged hard choices. Matthias saw it in the gaunt faces of sailors who'd gambled their last coins on a voyage that never sailed, in the wary eyes of traders who guarded their wares against thieves, in the quiet fear of Guanche families pushed to the edges of the town. The promise of new lands had drawn people here, but it had also exposed their vulnerabilities, and Matthias was learning that the sea gave nothing without taking its due. One morning, as Matthias hauled water from the plaza's well, he overheard a heated exchange near the fish market. A Portuguese sailor, his face scarred and his voice rough with drink, was shouting at a Guanche vendor selling dried cod. "You think you can cheat me, islander?" he snarled, shoving the vendor's stall. The wooden frame creaked, spilling fish onto the cobbles. The vendor, a wiry man with a weathered face, stood his ground, his hands raised but his eyes defiant. "The price is what I said, senor. Take it or leave." The crowd watched, tense, as the sailor's hand drifted to his knife. Matthias's stomach twisted. He'd seen such moments before, small sparks that could ignite violence. A Castilian guard stepped in, his voice sharp, and the sailor backed off, muttering curses. But the incident lingered, a reminder of how quickly trust could fray. Hunger was another spectre. The Canaries' markets were bountiful for those with coin, but Matthias's earnings were meagre, barely enough for a loaf of bread and a scrap of cheese. Some days he went without, the ache in his belly a constant companion. He saw it in others, too, children scavenging for dropped fruit, sailors trading their knives for a sack of barley, Guanche women bartering woven mats for a handful of gofio. One evening, Matthias shared his last crust with a boy no older than 10, his ribs sharp under a tattered shirt. The boy wolfed it down, his eyes bright with gratitude, and Matthias felt a pang of guilt for having so little to give. The islands were rich in trade, but wealth was uneven, and the promise of new lands did little to fill empty stomachs. Shafts of deceit wove through the port like threads in a net. Matthias learned this the hard way when a smooth-talking Genoese offered him a chance to join a ship bound for the African coast. "A map-maker like you? They'll pay well in Argon," the man said, his smile too easy. Matthias, eager for a chance to sail again, nearly handed over his few coins as a deposit for the berth. But something in the man's eyes, a flicker of greed, made him hesitate. He asked around and learned the ship didn't exist. The Genoese was a known swindler, preying on dreamers like Matthias. The betrayal stung, not just for the lost opportunity, but for the reminder that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The sea itself was a source of dread. Matthias heard stories from sailors in the taverns, their voices low as they spoke of storms that tore sails to ribbons, of currents that dragged ships onto reefs, of crews driven mad by thirst. One night, in a smoky corner of the Taberna del Viento, a grizzled Basque pilot named Zabia told a tale that chilled Matthias to the bone. His ship, caught in a squall off the Azores, had lost half its crew to waves that rose like mountains. "The sea doesn't care about your maps, boy," Zabia said, his eyes distant. "It takes what it wants." Matthias sipped his watered wine, the taste bitter on his tongue, and felt the weight of the unknown pressing closer. Columbo's silence loomed large. Had he met such a fate? Were his ships splintered on some uncharted rock, their crews food for the deep? The danger wasn't just at sea. In Las Palmas, tensions between groups simmered, often erupting in small but ugly ways. The Castilian authorities, eager to assert control, cracked down on Guanche gatherings, calling their rituals pagan. Matthias saw priests in black robes preaching in the plaza, their voices sharp as they urged conversion. The Guanche, proud but weary, kept their traditions alive in secret, their songs and dances hidden in the hills. Matthias once stumbled upon such a gathering, led by Tenosu's uncle, a wiry elder named Ios. Under a moonlit sky, they burned herbs that filled the air with a sharp, sweet scent, chanting to stars Matthias now knew as Tuburient. He stayed at the edge, unseen, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this world was slipping away, pressed under the weight of new arrivals. Even in Ibrahim's shop, the darkness crept in. One afternoon, a Castilian official arrived, his boots polished and his manner cold. He demanded to see Ibrahim's charts, claiming they might aid the crown's interests. Ibrahim complied, his face a mask, but Matthias saw the tension in his hands as he unrolled the vellum. The official lingered over a map of the Western Ocean, its edges blank, and asked pointed questions about Colombo's route. Ibrahim answered vaguely, his voice calm but his eyes sharp. When the man left, Ibrahim muttered, "They'll take what they want, boy. Knowledge, land, lives. Guard your work." Matthias nodded, his stolen map from Lisbon suddenly feeling like a dangerous secret. Yet amid the hardship, there were glimmers of resilience. Matthias saw it in the way people adapted, finding ways to endure. In the market, a Guanche woman taught a Castilian cook to grind gofio, her hands patient as she showed him the rhythm of the stone. In return, the cook shared a recipe for a fish stew thick with peppers, its scent wafting through the stalls. Matthias tasted it once, the heat blooming on his tongue, and marveled at how necessity could forge such exchanges. In the taverns, sailors swapped skills, knots, star-reading, ways to mend a sail, each teaching the other to survive the sea's whims. Matthias, too, learned to navigate the darkness. He grew sharper, less trusting, but he refused to let it harden him. When Tenosu brought him a basket of figs one evening, their skins purple and bursting with sweetness, he shared them with a group of dockworkers, their laughter a brief shield against the night's chill. When a storm battered the harbor, sinking a small fishing boat, Matthias joined the effort to salvage what they could, hauling sodden nets under a sky heavy with rain. His hands blistered, his cloak soaked, but the work felt like defiance, a way to push back against the chaos. One night, as Matthias sat in the shop, copying a chart by candlelight, Ibrahim spoke of Colombo again. "If he's alive, he's seen things we can't imagine," the old man said, his voice soft. "But the sea doesn't give gifts lightly. Whatever he's found, it'll come with a cost." Matthias looked up, the quill still in his hand. What kind of cost? Ibrahim's eyes were dark, unreadable. Lives, trust, maybe the world itself. Every discovery breaks something to make something new. Matthias lay awake that night, the words echoing in his mind. The Canaries had shown him beauty, songs, flavors, faces, but they'd also shown him the shadows, hunger, deceit, the clash of worlds. He thought of his map, its blank spaces waiting to be filled, and wondered what price the new lands would demand. Would they be a haven, a place of plenty, or another crucible where dreams met danger? And what of him? Could he face that cost, or would it break him as it had others? He rose before dawn, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. The harbor was quiet, the ships ghostly in the mist. Matthias pulled his cloak tight and walked to the water's edge, his satchel heavy with the weight of his sketches and dreams. The sea stretched before him, vast and unyielding, holding answers he couldn't yet see. Colombo's silence was a question, a challenge, and Matthias felt it pulling him forward, into the dark. The mist hung low over Las Palmas as November 1492 crept into the Canaries, wrapping the harbor in a veil that softened the edges of ships and muffled the cries of gulls. Matthias had been on the islands for nearly 3 months now, and the frenetic energy of his early days had settled into something steadier, more rooted. The Canaries were no longer just a way station. They were a living, breathing world of their own, where people carved out spaces of belonging amid the chaos of trade and ambition. The rumor of Colombo's voyage still lingered, a ghost in every conversation, But life in Las Palmas pressed on, shaped by the daily rhythms of work, laughter, and shared fires. For Matthias, this was a time of discovery, not of distant lands, but of the small, stubborn communities that held the islands together, turning strangers into kin under a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Matthias's days in Ibrahim's shop had found a cadence. He rose with the dawn, when the air was sharp with dew and the scent of baking bread drifted from the plaza. His hands, once clumsy with exhaustion, now moved with purpose, tracing coastlines and currents with a precision that earned Ibrahim's rare praise. The old Moor had begun to trust him with more delicate tasks, annotating star charts, calculating distances between islands, even sketching speculative maps based on sailors' tales. The work was demanding, but it gave Matthias a place, a role in the tapestry of Las Palmas. And beyond the shop, he saw how others were weaving their own threads, building communities from the raw materials of hope and necessity. The heart of Las Palmas was its plaza, a cobbled square where the town's pulse beat strongest. By day, it was a market, alive with the clatter of carts and the shouts of vendors hawking fish, olives, and bolts of dyed cloth. By night, it transformed into a gathering place, where sailors, traders, and locals shared stories around bonfires that crackled with pine and driftwood. Matthias had become a regular here, drawn by the warmth of the flames and the promise of company. The air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced wine, and the laughter that rose from the crowd was a balm against the uncertainties of the sea. One evening, Matthias joined a group of dockworkers and Guanche laborers at the plaza's edge, where a fire cast flickering shadows on their faces. They passed around a clay jug of palm wine, its sweetness cut by a faint tang of fermentation, and shared a meal of gofio mixed with honey and almonds, served on broad banana leaves. The gofio was gritty, sticking to the roof of Matthias's mouth, but its warmth filled him, grounding him in the moment. A Guanche man named Mensi, his hands calloused from hauling nets, told a story of his grandfather, who'd navigated the island's waters by reading the stars. He said the sky was a map, Mensi said, his voice low and reverent. Every light a story, every story a path. Matthias listened, his quill scratching notes on a scrap of vellum. He sketched Mensi's face, the firelight catching the lines of his jaw, and felt a kinship with this man who saw the world as he did, not just as land and sea, but as stories waiting to be told. The group grew as the night deepened, joined by a Castilian sailor named Diego, who sang a ballad of lost love in a voice rough but true, and a Moorish trader who offered a prayer in Arabic, its cadence blending with the crackle of the fire. These moments, Matthias realized, were the island's true wealth, not gold or spices, but the fragile bonds forged over shared meals and songs. The Canaries were a patchwork of such communities, each with its own rituals and rhythms. In the hills above Las Palmas, Guanche families maintained their traditions, gathering in hidden groves to honor their gods with offerings of milk and grain. Matthias had been invited once by Tenosu, who led him to a clearing where her kin danced under a canopy of stars. The air was cool, scented with wild lavender, and the ground vibrated with the beat of drums made from goatskin. Tenosu's mother, a woman with eyes like polished obsidian, pressed a cup of fermented honey into his hands, its taste sharp and wild. "You're one of us tonight," she said, and Matthias felt a warmth that went beyond the drink, a sense of belonging he hadn't known since Lisbon. In the town, other communities took shape. Sailors formed loose brotherhoods, bound by the shared trials of the sea. Matthias saw them in the taverns, swapping tales of storms and shoals, their hands moving in gestures that mimicked the roll of waves. They had their own language, a mix of Portuguese, Spanish, and sailors' slang, and their own rituals, carving charms into driftwood, toasting to Neptune before a voyage. Matthias joined them when he could, learning to tie knots and read the wind's shifts, his hands growing stronger, his shoulders broader. The sailors teased him for his ink-stained fingers, calling him the map boy, but they shared their bread and stories, folding him into their rough-edged family. Even the shop was a community of sorts. Ibrahim, gruff as he was, had softened toward Matthias, sharing snippets of his life in Granada, tales of almond orchards and tiled courtyards, now lost to him. Another apprentice, a quiet Castilian named Alvaro, joined them some days, his hands clumsy but eager. The three worked in silence or traded stories, their voices blending with the scratch of quills and the creak of the shop's wooden beams. One afternoon, Ibrahim cooked a tagine of lamb and apricots, its steam filling the shop with a scent of cumin and sweetness. They ate together, cross-legged on the floor, and Matthias felt a flicker of home, fragile but real. Yet these communities were not without their fractures. The plaza's warmth could turn cold when rivalries flared, Castilians against Portuguese, Guanche against newcomers, traders against sailors. Matthias saw it in the way eyes narrowed when a Moorish merchant passed, or when a Guanche labourer was paid less than his Castilian counterpart. The island's prosperity rested on trade, but trade bred competition, and competition bred resentment. One night, a brawl broke out in the plaza when a sailor accused another of stealing his purse. Fists flew, and a knife flashed before the crowd pulled them apart. Matthias, watching from the sidelines, saw the cost of mistrust, the way it frayed the bonds that held the town together. The sea, too, tested these communities. Ships came and went, bringing news that could lift spirits or shatter them. One morning, a caravel limped into the harbor, its sails torn and its crew gaunt. They'd been caught in a storm off the African coast, losing 3 men to the waves. The survivors were welcomed with food and wine, their stories heard with quiet respect, but Matthias saw the fear in their eyes, a reminder that the sea was no respecter of bonds or dreams. Colombo's absence hung over these moments, a shadow that grew longer with each passing week. Had he found land, or had the ocean claimed him? The question lingered, unanswered, binding the town in a shared uncertainty. Matthias found his own place in these communities, small though it was. He began teaching Tanosu to read the stars, using the astrolabe he'd taken from Lisbon. One night, on a hill overlooking the harbor, he showed her how to find Polaris, its light steady amid the swirling sky. "It's the anchor," he said, his breath visible in the cool air. "No matter where you sail, it's there." Tanosu traced the star with her finger, her face lit by moonlight, and Matthias felt a connection deeper than words. She, in turn, taught him a Guanche song, its melody soft and winding, like a river through the hills. He hummed it as he worked, a thread of her world woven into his. The plaza's fires became his refuge, a place to share and listen. He brought his sketches, showing them to Mency or Diego, who offered gruff praise or teasing corrections. "Your islands look like squashed figs," Diego laughed once, clapping Matthias's shoulder. But they listened when he spoke of the mare ignotum, of the lands he imagined beyond the horizon. Matthias began to see himself not just as a mapmaker's apprentice, but as a keeper of stories, a bridge between the worlds that met in Las Palmas. One evening, as the fire burned low and the crowd thinned, Ibrahim joined Matthias in the plaza. The old man rarely left his shop, but tonight he carried a small clay pot of coffee, its bitter aroma curling into the air. They sat in silence for a time, watching the embers glow. "This place," Ibrahim said at last, "it's a fleeting thing. People come, they build, they fight, they leave. But while they're here, they make something, a life, a story." Matthias nodded, thinking of Tanosu's song, Mency's tales, the knots he'd learned from Diego. The Canaries were a crossroads, but they were also a home, however temporary. The talk of Colombo flared anew that night. A ship from Seville had brought word. A sailor claimed to have seen one of Colombo's ships, far to the west, its sails tattered but intact. The news was unconfirmed, a spark in the dark, but it set the plaza alight with speculation. Matthias felt it too, the pull of possibility. The communities he'd found here, Guanche, sailors, traders, had given him strength, a sense of place. But the horizon called, louder now, and he knew he could not stay forever. As he walked back to the shop, the air cool and heavy with the scent of salt, Matthias clutched his satchel, its weight a reminder of the maps and stories he carried. The Canaries had shaped him, but they were only a beginning. What lay beyond, lands, peoples, dangers, waited to be drawn. Would he find a place in those new worlds, or would they demand a price he wasn't ready to pay? The Canaries, as November 1492 deepened, seemed to hold their breath under a sky heavy with clouds. The harbour of Las Palmas, once a frenzy of sails and shouting, had settled into a quieter rhythm, as if waiting for the world to reveal its next move. Matthias, now a familiar figure in the town's cobbled streets, felt the weight of his months here. His hands tougher, his eyes sharper, his heart tethered to the people and stories he'd gathered. The rumour of Colombo's voyage, still unanswered, hung like a shadow, but it was no longer just a spark of adventure. It was a question that reshaped everything. The islands, the people, the maps Matthias drew in Ibrahim's shop. This was a time for reflection, for tracing the ripples of what had been and what might yet be. The Canaries, Matthias realized, were not just a crossroads but a crucible, where the seeds of a new world were being sown, their legacy already taking root in ways no one could fully grasp. Matthias's days in the shop had become a ritual, a steady pulse of ink and vellum that anchored him. The air was thick with the scent of wax and sea salt, carried through the open window from the harbour below. He worked with a quiet confidence now, his quills tracing coastlines with a precision that surprised even Ibrahim. The old Moor had begun to treat him less as an apprentice and more as a partner, sharing stories of his youth in Granada over cups of bitter coffee, its steam curling like a memory. Matthias's maps were no longer just copies. They were his own, infused with the stories he'd heard in the plaza, the songs Tonosu had taught him, the warnings of sailors like Diego. Each line was a reflection of the world he'd come to know, a world vast, fragile, and alive. But reflection came with questions. What had Colombo's voyage set in motion? What would it mean for the Canaries, for the Guanche, for the traders and dreamers who called this place home? And what of Matthias himself, a boy who'd left Lisbon with a stolen map and a head full of dreams? The answers were unclear, but the islands had changed him, and he could feel their influence spreading, like ink bleeding into vellum. The legacy of Colombo's voyage, even in its silence, was already reshaping the Canaries. The islands had long been a stepping stone for explorers, but now they were a beacon, drawing men and women from across the known world. Ships crowded the harbour, their holds heavy with wine, wool, and dreams of new trade routes. Merchants speculated on spices and gold, their voices sharp with ambition, while sailors swapped tales of lands that might or might not exist. Matthias saw it in the plaza, where the crowds grew denser each week, their languages a tapestry of Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, and Guanche. The town was swelling, its streets narrower, its markets louder, as if the very stones were stretching to accommodate the influx. This growth brought change, both bright and shadowed. New taverns sprang up, their walls ringing with laughter and song, their tables laden with dishes that blended old worlds and new. Guanche gofio served with Castilian stews, Moorish spices in Portuguese fish soups. Matthias tasted it all, his palate alive with cumin, honey, and smoked paprika, each bite a reminder of the island's role as a meeting place. Yet the growth strained the town's resources. Water from the wells grew scarcer, the lines longer. Bread prices crept higher, and Matthias saw hunger in the eyes of those who couldn't pay. The Guanche, pushed to the margins, worked harder for less, their songs quieter now, their dances hidden in the hills. In the shop, Ibrahim spoke of the broader impact. Colombo's voyage, if it succeeds, will change the maps, he said one evening, his hands tracing a chart of the Western Ocean. But maps are not just lines, boy. They're power. Whoever claims those lands will claim the wealth, the trade, the future. Matthias nodded, his mind turning to the Guanche, whose lands had already been claimed by Castilians. Would the new worlds, if they existed, follow the same path? Would they lift people up or grind them down? The question lingered, heavy as the clouds outside. Matthias saw the legacy taking shape in the people around him. Tenosu, with her quick smile and Guanche songs, was learning Spanish from a Castilian nun, her voice halting but determined. "If the world is growing," she told Matthias one evening, her hands kneading dough, "I want to speak its language." Yet her eyes held a flicker of loss, a knowledge that her people's ways were fading under the weight of newcomers. Matthias, in turn, taught her to read his maps, pointing out the stars he'd learned to navigate by. "These don't change," he said, echoing Ibrahim, "no matter who claims the land." Tenosu traced Polaris with her finger, her face lit by the lantern's glow, and Matthias felt a pang of hope. She was building her own bridge to the future. The sailors, too, were part of this legacy. Diego, the Castilian who sang of lost love, had joined a crew bound for the African coast, chasing trade routes that might open if Colombo's path proved true. Before he left, he gave Matthias a small carved anchor. It would smooth from years at sea. "For luck," he said, his grin wide. "You'll need it if you follow that Genoese fool." Matthias kept the anchor in his satchel, a talisman alongside his maps, a reminder of the bonds that held him to this place. Even Ibrahim, gruff and guarded, was leaving his mark. His charts, copied by Matthias and Alvaro, were carried aboard ships that sailed to Lisbon, Seville, and beyond. They guided captains through treacherous currents, marked safe harbors, and whispered of possibilities in the mare ignotum. One afternoon, as they worked, Ibrahim handed Matthias a map he'd drawn years before, its edges worn but its lines bold. "This was Granada," he said, pointing to a city of rivers and gardens. "Keep it. Remember what's lost, and what you can still build." Matthias folded it carefully, its weight a reminder that every map was a story of loss and creation. The plaza remained the heart of this emerging legacy. One night, as a bonfire crackled and the air grew thick with the scent of roasted goat and pine, Matthias joined a crowd to hear a Guanche elder tell a story of the island's creation. The elder's voice was low, rhythmic, weaving a tale of gods who shaped the land from fire and sea. The crowd, sailors, traders, Guanche, Moors, listened in silence, their faces lit by the flames. Matthias sketched as he listened, capturing the elder's hands, the flicker of firelight, the stars above. When the story ended, a Portuguese sailor began a fado, its mournful notes blending with the elder's tale, and Matthias felt the threads of these worlds weaving together, fragile but enduring. Yet the legacy was not all harmony. The Canaries' growth brought tensions, arguments over land, disputes over trade, whispers of rebellion among the Guanche. Matthias saw it in the guarded glances of Castilian officials, the quiet defiance of Guanche laborers, the way Ibrahim hid certain charts when strangers visited the shop. The promise of new lands was a spark, but it could ignite conflict as easily as hope. Matthias wondered what Colombo's return, if he returned, would bring. Would it unite these communities or fracture them further? Would the new worlds be a canvas for creation or a battleground for power? As the days grew shorter, Matthias found himself reflecting on his own place in this legacy. He was no longer the boy who'd left Lisbon with a stolen map. The Canaries had toughened him, taught him to navigate not just seas but people, their dreams, their fears, their stories. He thought of his maps, each one a record of what he'd seen and heard, a way to carry the islands with him. He thought of Tenosu's songs, Ibrahim's wisdom, Diego's anchor, and felt a responsibility to preserve them, to draw not just land but the lives that filled it. One evening, as he sat by the harbor, the air cool and scented with seaweed, Matthias unfolded his sketch of the plaza, the oud player, Tenosu's smile, the fire's glow. It was more than a drawing. It was a map of the Canary's heart, a testament to the communities that had shaped him. The rumor of Colombo's voyage had brought him here, but it was the people, their laughter, their struggles, their shared fires, that had made him stay. Now, as whispers of Colombo's return grew louder, Matthias felt a shift. The world was changing, and he was part of it, a cartographer of stories as much as seas. But what would that change mean? Would the new lands, if they existed, carry the warmth of the plaza's fires, or the shadows of its tensions? And what role would Matthias play? A scribe, a sailor, a dreamer? The answers lay west, where the sea met the sky, and Matthias knew his time in the Canaries was drawing to a close. The winter of 1492 had settled over Las Palmas, wrapping the Canaries in a cool embrace that softened the harbor's usual clamor. The sky was a deep, endless blue, streaked with clouds that drifted like sails across the horizon. Matthias stood at the edge of the docks, his satchel heavier now with maps, sketches, and the small tokens of his months here. A carved anchor from Diego, a scrap of vellum with Tenosua's Guanche song, a worn star chart from Ibrahim. The rumor of Colombo's voyage, which had drawn him from Lisbon's cobbled streets, had finally broken into truth. Word had reached the islands that the Genoese had returned to Spain, his ships battered but intact, bearing tales of lands across the Mare Ignotum. The news was a spark, igniting the Canaries with a fervor Matthias had never seen. For him, it was the end of one journey and the beginning of another, a moment to weave the threads of his time here into a story that would echo into the present. The harbor was alive with anticipation. Ships prepared to sail west, their crews buzzing with dreams of gold and glory, while merchants haggled over provisions and maps, their voices sharp with ambition. Matthias felt it too, the pull of the unknown, stronger now that Colombo's discovery had redrawn the edges of the world. But as he stood watching the waves lap against the docks, the air thick with the scent of tar and salt, he knew his story was not just about the lands beyond. It was about the Canaries, the people who had shaped him, and the traces they'd left in his heart and hands. This final chapter was not just an end, but a bridge, connecting the fires of Las Palmas to the world he lived in now. Matthias's last days in the shop were a quiet farewell. Ibrahim, his eyes softer than Matthias had ever seen, gave him a final gift, a small astrolabe, its brass worn but gleaming, etched with stars that had guided sailors for centuries. "You'll need this," the old Moor said, his voice rough but warm. "The sea is vast, but the stars are constant." Matthias clutched the instrument, its weight a promise, and thanked Ibrahim with a nod, words failing him. The shop, with its scent of ink and vellum, had been his refuge, a place where he'd learned to see the world not just as lines on a map, but as stories woven from human lives. In the plaza, Matthias sought out Tenosu one last time. She stood by her mother's stall, her hands dusted with flour, her dark eyes bright as she handed him a small loaf of sesame bread, still warm from the oven. "For the journey," she said, her smile tinged with sadness. Matthias took it, the crust crisp under his fingers, and promised to carry her songs with him. "Sing them to the stars," she said, pointing to the sky where Tiburient would shine. They stood in silence for a moment, the air scented with honey and sea, and Matthias felt a pang of loss, not for a place, but for the connection they'd built, fragile yet enduring. The sailors, too, marked his departure. In the Taberna del Viento, where the air was thick with smoke and laughter, Matthias shared a final cup of palm wine with Menzi and a few others. They toasted to the sea, to Colombo's new lands, to the maps Matthias would draw. Menzi, his hands rough from nets, clapped Matthias's shoulder. "You're one of us now, map boy," he said, his grin wide. "Wherever you go, you carry the islands." Matthias nodded, his throat tight, and tucked their stories into his satchel, alongside Diego's anchor and Tenosua's bread. Matthias had secured a berth on a caravel bound for Hispaniola, one of the lands Colombo claimed to have found. The ship, La Esperanza, was a sturdy vessel, its hull scarred from Atlantic storms but its sails fresh and taut. Matthias's role was humble, assistant to the ship's navigator, tasked with charting their course and sketching what they found. It was a chance to see the new world, to draw its shores, to test the dreams that had carried him from Lisbon. As he boarded, the deck creaking under his boots, he felt the weight of his journey. The hunger, the betrayals, the songs, the fires. The Canaries had been his crucible, forging him into someone who could face the unknown. The voyage west was both exhilarating and terrifying. The sea stretched endless, its surface a mirror for the sky's moods, calm one day, roiling the next. Matthias worked by lantern light, plotting stars and currents, his hands steady despite the ship's sway. He ate sparingly, hardtack, dried fish, the last of Tenossus bread, its sesame lingering like a memory. At night, he stood at the rail, the air cool and sharp with salt, and watched the stars, whispering their Guanche names. The world was vast, but he was no longer alone in it. The Canaries had given him a map not just of seas, but of human connection, and he carried it with him. When La Esperanza reached Hispaniola, Matthias stepped onto a shore unlike any he'd known, white sand fringed with palms, the air heavy with the scent of unfamiliar flowers. The native Taino greeted them with curiosity and caution, their language a melody Matthias couldn't yet pass. He sketched their canoes, their woven huts, the way they offered fruit that burst with sweetness on his tongue. But he saw shadows too, Castilian soldiers with swords, the glint of greed in their eyes, the same tensions he'd seen in Las Palmas. The new world was not a blank slate. It was another crossroads, where stories would clash and blend, just as they had in the Canaries. Centuries later, the echoes of Matthias's time linger. The Canaries remain a bridge between worlds, their streets alive with the descendants of Guanche, Castilians, Moors, and sailors. The gofio Matthias ate is still ground in stone mills, served with honey or stew, its taste a thread to the past. The songs Tenossu sang live in the music of the islands, their melodies woven into modern rhythms, played in festivals where bonfires still burn. The maps Matthias drew, or those inspired by his work, shaped the voyages that followed, redrawing the world in ways he could only imagine. In Lisbon, the Alfama's cobbled streets still hum with life, their taverns filled with the scent of grilled sardines and the sound of fado, a cousin to the songs Matthias heard. The Tagus River carries ships, now steel and vast, but their crews still speak of the sea with reverence and fear. In the Canaries, the Plaza of Las Palmas is a market by day, a gathering place by night, where voices in Spanish, Arabic, and countless others blend under the same stars Matthias knew as Tiburient. The astrolabe Ibrahim gave him, or one like it, sits in a museum, its brass polished, a silent witness to a world remade. The legacy of Colombo's voyage, and the countless journeys it sparked, lives in the languages we speak, the foods we eat, the maps we draw. Matthias's story, a boy with a stolen map, a heart full of dreams, mirrors our own, a reminder that discovery is not just about land but about the people who shape it. The Canaries taught him to see the world through their eyes, Tenossus, Ibrahim's, Menzies, and that vision endures in the way we navigate our own crossroads, blending old worlds with new. Matthias's final act, as he stood on Hispaniola's shore, was to unfold his map from Lisbon, its edges worn but its lines still bold. He added a new island, its shape rough, born from the Taino's words and his own eyes. The Mare Ignotum was no longer blank. It was alive with possibility, with stories waiting to be told. He tucked the map away, the sea breeze cool on his face, and felt a quiet peace. He had been part of something vast, a spark that lit a fire across oceans and centuries. The world was bigger now, and he was ready to draw it. As he turned to join the crew, the waves whispered against the shore, carrying the scent of salt and promise. Matthias smiled, his satchel heavy with the past, his eyes fixed on the future. He was home, wherever that might be. And so, the story ends, not with a close but with a bridge. The Canaries, Hispaniola, the seas between, they live in us, in the bread we break, the songs we sing, the maps we carry in our hearts. Matthias's journey is ours, a reminder that every step into the unknown is a chance to weave new stories, to find connection in the vastness of the world. As the stars shine over Los Palmas tonight, they whisper the same truth Mateus learned. The world is wide, but its heart is human.